여러분, 저에게도 이런 날이 오네요. 오늘 정말 정말 특별한 분을 모셔서 인터뷰를 한번 진행해 봤고요. 저는 AI에 대응하는 인간의 마지막 자존심, 로저라고 합니다. 제가 최근에 메타버스, NFT 이런 거에 좀 꽂혀가지고 영상을 몇 개 만들어 봤었어요. 근데 이 영상에 제가 굉장히 존경하고 좋아하는 이 야츠 분을 몇 번 이야기를 했었거든요. 왜냐면 이분이 워낙 이제 메타버스의 아버지, 매버지 이시도 하고 좋은 내용이 많아서 좀 공유를 해드렸었는데 야츠가 연락이 오셨어요. 왜냐면 너 로저 컨텐츠를 보니까 너무 좋기도 하고 나랑 한번 인터뷰를 해보자. 로저야 우리 인터뷰 한번 할까 해서 저는 생각도 안 하고 흔쾌히 승낙을 했죠. 왜냐면 제가 워낙 팬이기도 하고 하기 때문에 그래서 오늘 인터뷰를 만들어 봤고요. 이 인터뷰가 정말 국내 최고 퀄러티라고 저 로저가 보증하겠습니다. 이런 이야기는 사실 뭐 탈중앙화, 블록체인, 메타버스 정말 모든 거를 아우르는 탈중앙화 관련된 이야기를 하는데 어디 가서도 이런 이야기는 못 듣는다라고 제가 장담합니다. 정말 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 너무너무 내용이 좋기 때문에 근데 한 가지 단점은 좀 길다. 길어서 저도 번역하느라고 정말 죽을 뻔했는데 기니까 좀 뭐 주말에 나눠 보시든 그거는 뭐 알아서 하시면 될 것 같은데 하여튼 꼭 끝까지 봐주셨으면 좋겠다라는 말씀 드리면서 그러면 긴 말 없이 영상 보시도록 하겠습니다. Let's go. Alright, hello and welcome to our interview with Yatsu, the legend himself. Yatsu is the founder and chairman of Animoca Brands, and it's good to have you here, Yat.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
All right. I know you're very famous, but you're not quite there in Korea yet. So, first of all, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into this crypto NFT metaverse space?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. And we really got into the space in 2017 with CryptoKitties. The history of us is that we were a gaming company. Actually, we still are in some ways a gaming company, but we had a actually investment in a studio in Vancouver called Fuel Powered that shared an office and was helping build this little project called CryptoKitties in Vancouver. And that other company was called Axiom Zen. And so basically what happened there was is that they created this experiment with CryptoKitties. And as you well know, it just took off like crazy.
It
And
did, yeah.
yeah, it did. And back then the numbers, everyone said, "Oh, $30 million of sales, like incredible." Of course, it's nothing compared to today, but back then those are big numbers. And the co-founder of that studio, instead of joining Animoca Brands, what was the original plan, he ended up becoming co-founder of what became Dapper Labs, which is the studio, of course, behind CryptoKitties and NBA Top Shot and so on. And as part of that, we became the publishers of CryptoKitties in January of 2018. Because when we saw that, we're just like, okay, this we think is going to change everything in terms of the world of digital assets and gaming at large. And we also became investors in Dapper Labs. And from that point on, I guess you could say we saw the future from our perspective. And this was in 2018. So the rest of the world probably didn't think of it quite that way at the time, but we just went all in. And the result that we have today as a business where we are is because of what really happened then, because we made all these investments, we made also acquisitions, we also built our own projects and products. Like in Korea, people may not know Animoca that well, but they probably know Sandbox,
Yeah,
right?
definitely,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
There are a lot
And
of
Sandbox,
traders in Korea who
that's right.
who went
That's
in,
right.
yeah,
Exactly,
yeah.
in Sandbox, that's right. And Sandbox is an Animoca Brands property. It's we're the majority shareholders today still, but it was always a subsidiary of Animoca Brands. But we let all of the studios and brands push their own products in a very independent manner, because you could say, we are all about decentralizing ourselves as well. So therefore, we give a lot of autonomy to all of the studios and projects and companies within Animoca Brands to really do what they need to do in this decentralized fashion.
Oh, I know you've made pretty successful investments as well recently. So
Hmm.
do you want to talk about that a little
Yeah,
bit? Yeah.
sure. Yeah. So as part of our thesis in Web3, we consider ourselves essentially builders and help create sort
Mm.
of the open metaverse. That's the mechanic. And so today we've done over 100 investments
Wow.
in the in the space. Many of those investments we really started in 2018, 2019, like for instance, OpenSea, and of course, you know about Dapper Labs, Sky
Mm.
Mavis, which is the company that created Axie Infinity, Wax, Decentraland, Bitsky, and then of course some more recent ones, like in Korea, we also invested in Nine Chronicles, for instance. So we made a whole series of these investments. The main thesis is that all of them are building open.
Mm.
And
Mm.
part of the reason we did it this way is that if you believe in a open web, and if you believe that all of our projects are going to decentralize, as a DAO, for instance, then there is no need to sort of control it, right? And also, just like when you build an open ecosystem, just like a country, you can't build everything yourself, right? You need to sort of have others come into the ecosystem, and you have to empower them to do it, right?
Mm.
And so to do that, you need to give them the best incentives. We believe very strongly in this idea that the best people are going to work with you, not for you. And so if you're going to get someone who is very motivated and shares your vision, then you work with them as a peer. And I think that's really how you build up sort of, like the strong infrastructure. You can see this in history as well. If you look at how open source developed, though
Mm.
there was no economic framework for open source, there was a peer level engagement. When people contributed code, they all contributed equally into the code as equals. I mean, you had some people who were like, okay, I know better code, I'm more experienced. Okay, you have that type of stuff maybe. But at a base level, everyone was an equal contributor to the code. If you didn't like it, you didn't have to use it. But nobody could stop you from adding code, and nobody could prevent you from using the code. So in that sense, it was a very democratic way of sharing information, perhaps the most democratic way. And this democratic way of coding has changed the world, right? Everything in the world is based on open source. The biggest companies in the world, including in Korea, without open source, they would not be competitive.
Mm.
So this is basically where we think Web3 with digital assets will develop as well. So it makes sense for us to make these investments and to empower all these companies and individuals to grow in that space. And in that sense, I want to make 300, 400 investments in a number of years. Right? It
Right,
doesn't
right.
make sense to say, and in the classic way of investing, people say, oh, you should focus on the winner, right? You should focus on this one. But in a shared space where you have a shared network effect, it doesn't make sense. Right? So
Mm.
that's, and also we don't think it's a better outcome, because in a zero sum game outcome, you have to ultimately focus on a monopoly, which we
Yeah.
think is a net negative, right? But in this sort of collaborative style, actually, everything can sort of gain and win, and that's why we describe sort of the metaverse like a country, because
Mm.
after all, what makes a successful country and the balancing of that is not that you have one big company, right, or one big system. In fact, you have everyone lifted up, right? The happiest countries are the ones where everyone has sort of growth opportunity and sort of and a chance for success, and somewhat of an equitable playing field, right? So that's
Mm.
basically how we view our philosophy. And then that also means that for the projects that we are building ourselves, like the Sandbox or Rev Racing
Mm.
or Gamey or Quid or all these projects, they're also all building open as well. Because what happens is that if we have enough investments and exposure in the open metaverse, it makes sure that even if we're not around anymore or whatever the reason may be, that the business model, the economic model, promotes open on the projects we're building ourselves.
Mm.
Because if we decide, for whatever reason, which will never happen, but let's imagine that Sandbox is quite popular now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
you could say, what happens if Sandbox decides to close, right? Then all of our portfolio and our investment on the other half will suffer too.
Mm.
So we're creating within the corporate structure a kind of balance so that we're always incentivized, not just philosophically, but
Mm.
economically, to develop, in the open manner.
Mm. Right, that's amazing. So most of our viewers are actually investors in the traditional finance. So do you want to explain how sort of blockchain technology empowers the open metaverse? Because
Yeah.
some of us might not have full understanding.
Well, so I think for, I guess, the traditional investor, if you think about it that way, the best way, parallel to look at this is you want to look at, what's the value, right? You're looking to invest in things like energy, for instance. Then you're going to look at, do you have access to the resources, right? Do you have access to energy? Do you have access to oil, right? And, 15, 20 years ago, the biggest companies in the world were generally energy companies because that was
Exxon, whatever.
Exxon, Aramco, British Petroleum, right?
Yeah.
Because they were the ones who had access to what was considered the most valuable resource at the time. Well, the most valuable resource today is data. If you take a look at all the top companies in the world, 90% are all data-rich companies. You could say they're software companies. That's true. They are software in a way, but they are not valuable software companies if they don't have the data to use. If data is cotton, then the software companies is the fabric, the factory, right? They create something valuable out of it.
Right.
They make the clothes and so on, and they sell it, and they create value from that. So as an investor, when you're buying into this type of stuff, where the resource is strangely not sort of scarce in location. Like in the past, you could say, okay, if I invest in this company, he has this area that has lots of gas or he has lots of oil, because I know the long-term sort of return I can calculate based on his oil reserves, right? But in the world of data, actually the data comes from us, it comes from the users. So the user numbers become a way to calculate, what is the strength of the data that becomes received from it. So if Facebook has lots of users, then that's good, because Facebook can make lots of money from the users through the data paradigm, right? In blockchain, I think you can do a similar kind of analysis in terms of looking at the community. When you look at the strength of a project, you look at, not just the leadership, but also the community. I think the leadership of that is important too, because the type of leadership attracts the community, right? So if you have a kind of leader that is maybe very extractive or very profit driven, for instance, that doesn't work, because actually it doesn't build the right kind of community. And we've seen this, back in 2017, 2018, during the sort of ICO boom and so on, right? The driver of being involved in the space was all about money and really all about extracting, right? And it was a very exploitative setup. And so that may provide short-term gains, but absolutely has no long-term value because of the type of leadership that was involved. Because also those type of leaders attracted a certain kind of person as well, right? That the result was very clear in late 2018 when it was crypto winter. The other thing that I would sort of tell investors to look at when you look at particularly investing in, not just projects like Sandbox, but also, when you look at chains and everything in the blockchain space, is that because of the community framework, you need to look at it almost like a country, right? So from a GDP standpoint, you can't look at it from a profit standpoint, like a normal company, which is very difficult because traditionally you invest in a project and you say, well, what's the profit? And what's my PE? And what's my long-term value?
So what are you investing? Are you investing in the equity? So like for instance, when I buy a Sandbox token, what are you buying in that sense?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So when you look at the two pathways to invest, there's obviously the equity, right? And then there is the token, right? So let's talk about the equity. The equity creates the intellectual property of the project. It is what the team is looking to sort of, own, build, and construct, right? Has the value of maybe the revenue share that might come from a part of the transaction fee. At the end of the day, the company is like any other company. It builds a business. But in that business construct, the success of its business comes from growing the community and the economy and the GDP of that community, which is represented in the token. So the token is essentially, if you think of it, whether it's a DAO or a structure, is what the community owns, can vote on, and essentially it's the way that the community takes ownership of that project. So one of the ways that the equity of benefits is that, and as time goes on, it may sell control of the DAO through selling its tokens or having people earn the token over time, so that basically the value it sort of accrues to the company, let's say one-off. But long-term, that benefit may not belong to the company anymore. It belongs to the it belongs to the owners of the token because they are essentially the stakeholders. So in a sort of country narrative, it's like when the government sells land. It sells land, it comes from its supply, right? It benefits from the taxes and the economic activity that the land will develop as the population cultivates it, which means that it doesn't have to sell the land at the highest price. It has to sell the land at a price that is conducive for economic activity, right? So maybe it means it may have to even give the land for free so that people come in and develop it, because the long-term effect comes from the return of its community. It doesn't come from selling one off. Now, if you're a traditional real estate developer, you don't think of it this way, right? You sell for as much money as you can and make another project, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the company essentially becomes almost like the establishment of its first government, or it sets the framework for the long term. The people then who come afterwards, they are the real estate developers. They're the ones who buy the land and develop on top of it. And this is where often investors sometimes have a hard time, because how do you measure profit of a country? Just imagine what happens in Korea if you want to increase the profit of the country. Well, you raise taxes, right? It's really easy, right? But the problem is what happens when you raise taxes? Actually, economic activity declines. People become unhappy, and the community suffers. And the irony, of course, is that how do you increase economic activity? You give money, right? You infuse
fiscal
actually capital.
spending. That's right.
Fiscal spending. That's right. So in an interesting way, you are actually putting money in the system. You are giving away. So this is what you see with our own projects, whether it's Rev or Sandbox. You can earn, right? When you play our metaverse games, you can earn what may look like free tokens, but we're not doing it because we just want to give everyone free tokens. I mean, sure, that's nice. Well, we're doing it to create fiscal spending. We're doing it to infuse economic activity through a thoughtful manner to create a long-term effect. And so that's the thing. So when you look at the inventory that the company has, you can't look at that inventory simply as, like, oh, this is your treasury and you can make money from it. You have to also look at it from the economic development standpoint. It has value, that is true, but the way you use that value to create a long-term effect is what's powerful. So the investor has to understand that effect. When a token increases in value, it's a reflection of the community. Right?
GDP,
it's not
right? Basically.
GDP, correct. It's a reflection of the GDP. It's not a reflection of the profit.
I see. So let's talk about Sandbox for a bit, because it's famous in Korea, and obviously the token price has surged a lot. Yeah. And so in the framework we've just talked about, I love the fact that you focus on the long-term vision, but in managing Sandbox, the game itself, are there any sort of short-term trade-offs you have to make for the long-term vision? I just wanted to ask, how's it going? How's Sandbox going?
Well, first of all, Sandbox is going great, right? At the moment, I think we're going really well. Seb and Artur are doing an amazing job in sort of, growing the business and creating the narrative. And really, I would say, broadly speaking, Sandbox has captured the open metaverse sort of meme, as it were. When people talk about the open metaverse, they think of the Sandbox, which is amazing. Yeah. And I think that's good, because I think people want to be able to understand, what it means to be open, and in some ways we can thank Facebook for saying we want to be the metaverse, right? Because actually they've put that word in everyone's head and everyone's thinking about it. And then Microsoft and even Dropbox and every company is like, we're building a metaverse.
Have you checked out the Korean stock market? We have companies that have said we're going to do metaverse, we're going to do NFTs. Stock price is going up like crazy.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of there's obviously a little bit of a hype there. Yeah. However, it's part of the narrative. It helps shape the market audience, right? Where people are saying, oh, okay, what is this? Maybe people have never heard of the word metaverse or understand it, and now they're trying to understand it better. And when they appreciate, what the real metaverse is, then Sandbox comes up in the conversation, and that's great. And you will have noticed that even Meta, as in Facebook Meta, has even started commenting on Sandbox Twitter.
I saw that. Yeah.
I'm like, oh wow, that's cool. But the trade-off, as in any growth of the business, of course, comes from the fact that we're dealing with some level of scarcity of land, for instance, right? And the value of land, has really gone up a lot, right? And it's a reflection of the economic activity. It's a reflection of the GDP, right? So because the community values the land, because the activity is growing and increasing, Just like, downtown Seoul is probably very expensive compared to
It is.
outside of Seoul. You have the same activity that's happening in Sandbox, meaning that Sandbox, is going to become more valuable probably in time, and therefore also somewhat less accessible for new players, which is of course the opportunity for new metaverses and new areas to build out. As Sandbox becomes kind of like a digital Manhattan, right? It's definitely, I think, leading the pack in that sense. But the trade-off basically becomes, as we are sort of embracing capitalism, the trade-off becomes that, it starts to become more expensive, and you have to balance that out against growing the community and building that network effect. And if you don't do it correctly, right, then what happens is you become a very wealthy place that is for very few people, right? And so that's the thing about how do you bring more people. Right now, Sandbox is growing incredibly fast, right? I mean, it's we used to celebrate when we had like 1,000 users a day. We're like, wow, 1,000 users a day, right? Now it's going into the hundreds of thousands of users, right?
Right.
It's growing so fast, which is also a reflection of the activity, and therefore the token price you're seeing comes from the demand of the growth of Sandbox, right? And just like we've seen, with things like Axie Infinity, once the growth starts to slow a little bit, then of course we hit a price point and we hit a balancing of the economy and some rebalancing mechanisms. It's important to note that this is such a new space. We have a long-term vision, but we certainly don't have all the answers as to the short-term execution, right?
Yeah.
Every time it comes out, you have to navigate. And, in a traditional sense, governments have to do the same thing. They can't build out a plan with a fixed vision. They have to react to market forces, to their population, to their citizens. We have to do exactly the same. The Sandbox therefore has to navigate like that.
Yeah, I've sometimes felt like these projects the dynamics are a bit like emerging markets where,
Yes.
the hot money flows into, for instance, South Korea. And it really depends what you do with the capital, with everything you have. And if it goes wrong, then you have a Asian financial crisis, right? But that's when it goes wrong. But if you use the capital in the right way, but like obviously the macro is important, but
right. Yeah. And I think this comes down to who's building it, right? As in, I think the leadership matters. What is their thinking, right? And I think when we look at how we invest, one way is, you have to build open. And then normally the people who build open have usually a kind of framework of thinking about the future. Because if you're building open, then you're more about sharing, and you're more about sharing the network effect, and you're more thinking about equity, right? And that means that if those are the kind of people who are helping shape, Web3, then I think for the long run, we should be good. Because we have seen what happens when the leaders are the kind of people from 3 or 4 years ago, basically just thinking about how much they can get. Right. Then you have a problem, right? And we've evolved to this point where I think all the people in this space are sort of, maybe not all, but a very large number really do care about decentralization and care about the future of Web3.
Amazing. I mean, I myself care about decentralization a lot. But let's talk about Sandbox in the context of the open metaverse. So my question was, how does the open metaverse work exactly? So if I have some items or NFTs in Sandbox, am I able to transfer that to other sort of metaverses? And like you can even move yourself, and like what are the mechanics?
And so the important thing to understand is that the composability that you describe is entirely possible. But the difference about this composability is that it's dependent on the sort of creator or the person or the company itself. One of the things that I often debate with, game companies, they're like, oh, well, you have a sword. Why would I use a sword in another game? And the whole point is, it's not about why they would use a sword. It's about the fact that this game company can choose to use a sword, or that the end user can choose to do it. So it's about choice that belongs to someone else because it's permissionless, not your decision to give him the ability to do so, right? So game companies still think very centralized because everything was constructed in this manner. And so in that construct, right, the open, because, it's whether it's an ERC 721 or whether it's something on Flow or whether it's something on Solana, it actually doesn't matter because you have full access to it because it's owned by someone's wallet. And so I can manipulate it and I can create a new experience. An example of this would be like, what's happening with, NFT lending or, fractionalization of NFTs. This is entirely permissionless. The creator of the NFT had no say or can provide no sort of, if someone just decides to make a lending platform and people can just start trading NFTs just because you own it. Now, when you think of the history of all innovation, ownership is the bedrock of innovation. Because what happens is that because I can really own it, I can now build a business on top of it. If I don't own it, I can't build a business because I might lose it tomorrow. But because you know that your ownership of real estate is assured by law, and you have confidence that the country will be around for a long time, so I can now build businesses with a long-term view that takes advantage of the fact that you have that ownership, right? And so this is when we talk about this paradigm in the digital space. Now that I can have long-term ownership of any digital asset, whether it is valuable or not, that's a different topic. I can now build a business on top of that and create a bigger network effect. So this is all about building network effects. When we talk about what's valuable, we say data is valuable. It is valuable because it's a resource, but data itself is not special because, it's like I can download all my data on Facebook. Okay, great. What I do with it. It's like the same, back, when the Russians were sort of sold Alaska to the US, maybe they knew there was oil. So because they don't know what to do. You needed the refinery to actually, the technology to basically make oil valuable. And when that happened, this useless resource for thousands of years now became very valuable. This is data. Data is like oil. It is not valuable by itself, but through the factory of essentially AI and machine learning, now data has become so valuable. But what makes it valuable is the construction of the network effect. And so what we're saying is that when you make open composability on these assets, you're actually owning a piece of the network effect and you have a share of that network effect. And that's what's powerful here, right? So I can build an NFT, I can put it on the market, and if nobody builds it because nobody owns it, it is not worth much, right? It's like if Leonardo da Vinci made a painting that nobody ever knew about, and he only sold it to one person in the world, nobody would care either, right? Because how many artists during the Renaissance have made paintings we have never heard of?
Exactly.
And it might be the scarcest painting in the world, but it has no value because it doesn't have a network effect, right? So Mona Lisa has one of the most powerful network effects because everyone knows of the painting, right? So
let me play devil's advocate here,
of course,
because you talk about network effects, and recently I watched an interview by Novogratz, and Novogratz was interviewing Mark Cuban. And what Mark Cuban said was, in the end, people don't care about decentralization. And it's about the networks that win. So it's about the networks that gain network effects that will eventually just win. And so I think his point is that if centralized gaming companies make better games and better, more fun games, then people will choose that. And people who play games don't actually care about decentralization. So what would be your response to that?
First, I have great respect for Mark Cuban, but I fundamentally disagree.
Okay.
And let me tell you why I disagree. If he just thinks of it in terms of games that are fun, I get it, right? Because there's no value attached and there's no fundamental ownership involved. But when there is ownership, right, you won't surrender it to someone who can take it away. Let's take Korea. What happens if, Korean government suddenly says, actually, you know what? We're changing all your property rights, right? Or we're adding new taxes to everything, right? What would the population in Korea do? They'll say, okay, sure, no problem. We'll do that. No,
that can never happen. No.
It can never happen. No. Why? Because there's a democratic institution. And why does a democratic institution matter? Because people want to make sure they protect what they own. So the point is this, and frankly, this is also the reason why we're in a rush as well, is that people need to understand the paradigm of ownership. Because you have ownership in your property and you care for the long-term effect, you care that this property can be passed on to your children, to your next generation, or that you can sell it and that you have the full monopoly of this particular ownership of these assets. You care about that. Therefore, you will never elect someone who can take it away from you. And you will also care about democracy, right? And you can see what happens in a healthy democratic environment, that at the end of the day, even if someone is elected who might not be someone who turned out to be good, you can remove that person, because the key element, and this is where I disagree with Mark Cuban a lot, is that we do not believe a structure can last if it does not serve a majority interest. So Facebook is an example where it may have monopolized the network effect, but it looks like it could be winning. But long term, if there is a better alternative, no user will use it, right? And before blockchain, that paradigm wasn't really possible. And the other big thing about this is, when you think about blockchain, it didn't just provide a framework where people can own their data in a decentralized fashion, right? Which is really kind of the more esoteric term. Decentralization as a term may not be as important as knowing that I can own it, that I actually have property rights over it. And to ensure property rights, it must be decentralized, because if it's centralized, you can always take it away. That's the paradigm that needs to be understood.
Yeah. No, I completely get that, and I agree with it. I was just playing devil's advocate.
No, I get it. And to some extent, what that tells me is that maybe Mark Cuban himself is still, while he definitely embraces, many aspects of Web3, because he made his money in Web2, and he made his money from the, a zero-sum approach.
Right.
He's thinking of a zero-sum outcome. And now my message to that is that would be kind of sad, right? Because you don't want to be backing winners in a sense that there would be a zero-sum outcome. When you create a situation where you have that, you create sort of someone that has absolute power. And as the proverb goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And then what happens is that particular setup then declines. So how do you create a lasting structure? Means it must serve a majority interest. How do you ensure that the majority interest has a say? The majority must own an interest, right? The users in Facebook don't own an interest, which is the reason why Facebook is making business decisions that benefit Facebook, maybe its shareholders, and the minority that controls Facebook. Yes, they have a monopoly, but people don't like Facebook. People do not describe Facebook in positive ways. If Facebook was a country, it is a country of many unhappy people. And when the better alternative comes about, maybe like the Future Sandbox or something else, right? They are the first ones to move if they have the opportunity to do so. And
let's talk about that. So let's say Web3 is intrinsically better than Web2. So what are you doing? What are the strategies you're using to bring people from, for instance, Facebook or in gaming in Korea, a lot of people play like League of Legends, right? So how do you bring people who don't know about Web3 and how do you bring those people into Web3?
Well, the first one, I think, which is, from our perspective, there's two parts. One of them is, all these investments that we're making, because they're all building exciting new projects, exciting new games, exciting new everything for Web3, right? So, if we, and we're not the only investors, right? You have many investors in the world that are also investing, like Andreessen Horowitz, and in Korea, you have Hash. As we, and that's a little bit sort of encouraging the market. We also have an accelerator as well. So if we get thousands and thousands of companies building cool stuff, then, for your, let's call it regular consumer, they will see better choices over time, because as I said earlier, we can't do it alone. So that's on the investing strategy. In terms of the approach, so, for instance, in the gaming side, in the earliest days, the gaming, if you look at something like Axie Infinity, which is very successful, but Axie Infinity is probably not the kind of game that your League of Legends player wants to play.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's what a lot of Koreans say. It's not a fun game in the Korean context. Yeah.
And that's fair at a stage where they want to play, more sophisticated games. And that's totally fine, because that is what people said about mobile games in 2010, 2011. When people saw Angry Birds, they said, that's not a game, right? Right. And I understand, right? Or if you remember the Java games on your Nokia phone, right? Those were very primitive, right? And so the point on this one is that, we are at a stage where to create sort of, AAA or high quality games, it takes time, right? It takes time to do that. But these games have started developing 2-3 years ago. So we now have as well, plus other companies have started building these games, and they're about to launch next year. And so the onboarding, where I'm very excited about, especially next year, is that the next wave is going to be these high quality games that they're accustomed to. Because you know what? You can make a blockchain game that actually is visually just as good and experiential, frankly, just as good as a AAA game. It does not have to be something that must look like Axie Infinity, which for the audience of Axie Infinity is sufficient. But I call it the Angry Birds of blockchain games because it's the same thing. It onboarded a whole new audience. It created a market. It demonstrated the potential. But the visual of Angry Birds might not be for everyone, right? So and Korea is a really great example, because if you remember, Korea actually was late to the digital adoption relative to the rest of the world. One of the most visionary things I think that Korea as a government did was to invest in broadband. And I remember when people were saying, why would you invest in broadband when your population, needs food? Right. I mean, it was literally it's only 30 years ago where people were talking about, Korea was not the cultural powerhouse. And that came because they invested in broadband infrastructure. What broadband did to Korea was supercharge a network effect in Korea. What the internet did societally around the world, but especially in Korea, because it had the best infrastructure compared to most of the world, is it connected people better and faster, and actually really benefited from Web 1, Web 2 ahead of others because it had the best infrastructure to create the network effect. Other places didn't even have dial-up internet, or they were just getting to broadband. The adoption was slow. And when the speed was slow, the creation of the network effect was limited. So Korea's advantage was that they were ahead of that game because they basically created that layer. Right? And so to this point here, how do we create this is, on a global basis, it's about laying out ways in which you access the network effect. So the great games, as players come in, step one, I play the game. That's great. I have these assets. But that's maybe not even the most interesting part. The more interesting part is another company says, you have these League of Legends NFTs, for instance. Well, let me use these League of Legends NFTs and do something different with it. Not just lending or fractionalization. Maybe I use it in another game. Well, actually, what you've created with that asset is another network effect. The thing about network effects that is not often understood is that because it's invisible, we don't know how to value it, right? The token infrastructure allowed us to create a value for the network effect. But every business we do, everything we do in life is about a network effect. Even the relationships I build with individuals is a network effect. In the old days, we used to trade that network effect as an information arbitrage. I know this price, you don't know that price, right? That is a network. That was a kind of network effect that this individual would arbitrage. It's still a network effect, right? And now this network effect is just, amplified because of these connections.
Yeah,
and in the
I
past,
feel like in Web3, I feel like network effects are almost exponential.
Yeah,
like you mentioned earlier. You make a League of Legends NFT, and that itself is network effects, and it creates further ones, right?
Right,
it just
exactly.
keeps going. It just keeps going.
It keeps going.
Yeah.
And then the thing is, each of the assets become a platform, right? That's why for content creators, this is amazing because and that's one of the reasons why we ended up doing a partnership with Cube, because after all, from a content side, right? They're actually we would be turning an organization like Cube that is traditionally a content creator actually into an asset creator. And each of the content that comes out of Cube, for instance, would then become a platform itself and has the ability to construct a network effect that is long lasting.
Okay, before we go into Cube and music metaverse, I know you have background in music and your parents were musicians. So what do you think of K-pop?
Well, so first of all, my daughter loves K-pop, and the world, frankly. I mean, if you think, I think K-pop is amazing. I think K sort of the whole K culture, K-drama, everything is incredible because, I I grew up overseas, right? Obviously, and in the 80s, and frankly, from a sort of Asian immigrant, if you will, living in culture in the past was a very sort of Western dominated thing, with Hollywood, with media and everything. the Asian culture, as it were, was really something that was, although it had a lot to offer to the world, frankly, was during my time was very isolated towards it. But because of diaspora, because of the internationalism, because of globalism, that has all basically sort of permeated. And in some ways, you could say that J-pop or sort of J culture was something that originally sort of moved ahead with manga and anime and so on.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
That was kind of the first, I guess, internationalized Asian trend. But really, what sort of supercharged it was sort of K-pop, K-drama, K-culture, and it's because of the fact. Again, I think it's the history, the background of how Korea emerged from a place that had was really kind of in a military dictatorship for a long, long time, and sort of unlocked and released sort of this energy that was there. And I do believe that things like broadband and the access of that information empowered the growth of that culture faster than elsewhere, because people could interact. K-pop is a reaction of youth culture. Youth culture communicates online much more rapidly. And if you have millions of youth connecting, you have a faster development than when you only have pockets of thousands connecting because of traditional measures. So I think Korea had a network effect advantage. So I have huge respect for what was achieved, and I'm a big fan of what it's doing for sort of putting the region on the map of the world.
All right, thanks for that. I really agree with your point about broadband, because actually in Korea, like years before Facebook, we had this thing called Psy World. It's like a cyber world. Yeah. And it was huge. And I was like, this is a great, business model, I guess. And then there comes Facebook. So yeah, Korea was really early in a lot of stuff. Okay. So when I looked into your joint venture with Cube Entertainment, you mentioned the phrase music metaverse. And I got really excited. I was like, this is the new thing. This is, like I should invest in this. But could you explain a bit about what music metaverse is, and how, and also how it links to the open metaverse?
Yes. Well, so with the foundation of everything that we consider the metaverse, it starts with ownership. So it doesn't really matter, what it is in terms of whether it's music or whether it's real estate or whether it's game items. It begins with ownership. And as you well know, music rights management and sort of, management of these things in music is famously complicated. But it's complicated because it was originally designed to protect sort of, the rights of creators in its original days, but now has become a bit of a monster to try to sort of figure that part out, right? But with the music metaverse, starting with ownership, the creative capital that is generated from music is very valuable, actually. It just isn't fairly distributed. And it is also difficult to compose on top of it because you don't know of that origin. Melody is an interesting example, right? You can actually, many songs would share similar chord structures. As a musician, I was always amused a little bit. If you learn, basically a basic set of chords, you can probably play 90% of most of the songs out there, which is great from an adoption standpoint, but very difficult to manage in terms of originality. And so the foundation of, for instance, in something like music rights may not even matter as much as to melody, but simply origination, just like we have with creative work. As an example, it may matter more that this melody came from, a famous artist, even if it has similarities to an unknown artist, right? Because it matters that it was the root of that particular creator. And I think this is an element that you couldn't do before with music, because the identity of music, there was no way to sort of audit the trail. You could only listen to the song, but you couldn't actually say, did it originate from this? And so just imagine, for instance, what it could do for remixing culture, for instance. I could remix similar tunes, but now I can remix similar tunes with authentic material. I think that's an example of what, for instance, the music metaverse can empower. And experiences, after all, the metaverse is all about enhancing your, we think of sort of, social, virtual, creative lives. And what is music, right? We feel with music, we have emotions with music, we cry with music, right? Like these are things that we go back to. And so to make the metaverse actually a deeper and richer experience, you have to bring in the world of music. You cannot ignore it, right? And I think that's what's so exciting about it. Above and beyond, the celebrities, the artists, they all also bring that in as well. I think music in itself is actually an unexplored area of what it could do to the metaverse.
So, are there any other areas apart from gaming and music that could apply to a metaverse?
So we think the metaverse applies to everything.
Everything.
Right?
Okay,
Everything.
okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that non-fungible tokens is going to be the way in which we can have the kind of ownership paradigm that is freely composable. So if you look at it sort of holistically, you've got the world of DeFi, and just broadly, crypto. It's become the global banking infrastructure. It's the finance system of the metaverse. Non-fungible tokens represents things, objects, assets of the metaverse, like the ownership of a house, the ownership of something, which is, as we had earlier described, amplifiable because you can construct basically network effects on top of network effects on top of network effects, just like open source. And the DAO essentially is the governmental structure or the corporate structure on top of that. And so when you combine those three together, actually you have a fully independent sort of country or organization. So we think that's the future. That's the metaverse, where we have an ownership in the governance and the ownership of the assets because of the property rights embedded with a financial system that already allows for these transactions to happen. Non-fungible tokens or Sandbox or what happened with Axie could not have worked if it wasn't for DeFi. It would be a nice game and we could have fun owning NFTs. But it would not create this economic framework if it wasn't for DeFi. They all need each other. And now we have it. And because it's decentralized, you can't stop it. That's the other thing, right?
I was a bit skeptical of DeFi at first. I mean, it was all about, yield farming, airdrops, like
Right.
what's behind it? But now with NFTs and metaverse, now it's, being used. There's real demand and stuff. So
No, I think one of the interesting things that is so different is that because of the origins of crypto, because with the birth of Bitcoin, it really started as a reaction to the financial system. It attracted more finance people in the beginning, and it didn't attract people that were into culture. They were more into finances, right? And so the consequence, of course, is that we ended up inviting the kind of people who built a banking system without anything to bank.
Yeah.
So all the speculation, all the things that we see comes from the fact that it started with finance first. So you had this odd situation where the infrastructure for what normally a banking system should service came first. And then when non-fungible tokens came in and finally got its moment, that's when people came to realize, wait, that infrastructure that DeFi created now actually provides, and cryptocurrencies, that infrastructure is now the basis and foundation that can add the real value. But the order was kind of unusual.
Reverse, I guess.
That's right. It was a reverse order, correct? Yeah.
So this world you're describing, where people spend a lot of time digitally. One definition of the metaverse I found interesting on Twitter was that metaverse is a moment in time. It's not a particular place, but it's a moment in time when humanity spends more time online, digitally, than physically. That really appealed to me. Anyway, this world, isn't it a bit scary? Like, who's like when I go to a Starbucks, like, who's gonna make me an Americano? How do you imagine that sort of world?
So I think similarly to how we think of, generally Web3, it's not a zero-sum outcome, meaning that just because the metaverse emerges doesn't mean the physical world disappears.
Right?
But some people do fear that, right? Because they go, oh my goodness, we'll spend more time online. I mean, what are we doing now? Right? Right? Yeah, exactly. Right. And we should talk about what the COVID effect is, because what COVID really did was it told the world that actually we could still exist, maybe in some ways better, entirely virtually than physically. Like, for instance, I don't travel, much at all right now. I can make more meetings. I can make more connections. I can frankly have more talks, right? But I can also spend time with my family. In some ways, I could say, being in this existence has its benefits too. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore the physical world. You need both. At the end of the day, we still need to eat and sleep and have good food, right? But I also think that marriage between the two is important because whatever money you end up making in the metaverse, you still have to pay taxes, right? And who are the beneficiaries of the taxes? The country, the government, wherever you live and stay, and the society that is physically there. So I think that at the end of the day, the blending of the two is there. The metaverse, the online world, which frankly speaking, we're already spending a lot of time on. On that definition, I would argue we're already in the metaverse.
We're already in the, right.
I mean, what is the first thing you do in the morning for most people? They probably look at their phone, right?
Check the price of Bitcoin.
Right. Yes. But yes, you look at that, right? So you're already and you're connected. And in fact, the smartphone has become the interface through your eyes, really almost like a body part. Can you imagine your life without your phone? It's going to be super hard.
No,
really hard, right? And then if you think about the time you spend on like Kakao, or the time that you spend on Google, or the time you spend playing online games,
YouTube,
right? YouTube, right? That's countless hours. Actually, your net time on hours online is probably already more in terms of presence and attention that you give in the physical world, right? If you think about the focus time of the physical versus the digital, I think most of us are already digital today. We don't think of it because we say, oh, I'm physically here. But when I'm looking at the phone, is my attention to the person I'm next to, or is my attention to what's on the phone? And very likely, if your attention is to the phone, then you're already here in the metaverse. And so the foundation to us is not about, how do we deal with the metaverse because we think it's already here. What's more important for us is who owns the metaverse. Because if the ownership of that metaverse, that time we spend online, cannot belong to us, then we are in trouble. Because only the people who have ownership of the data are the ones who gain the benefit, the network effect. And that means they become more powerful and they have more influence. But at the end of the day, that makes us essentially into serfs, right? And it makes them into kings, which is exactly what happened right now, right? So to us, the fight isn't about how do we move more people into the metaverse. The fake metaverse is already here, right? Actually, it's how do we move people from this fake metaverse into the true and open metaverse where you have ownership. That is where, the struggle is. And, I would argue, though, that in some ways, the train has already moved. And even the largest of companies will have great difficulties in holding it back.
All right. Thank you so much for doing this. Any plans on visiting Korea soon?
Well, I would love to visit Korea. It's just right now because of COVID, it's just difficult, especially coming back to Hong Kong and with this new sort of, virus strain, it's going to be harder. But, I would otherwise love to come to Korea. I used to travel there a fair bit, just because of everything. And I think the last time I was there actually was at the Hash conference when we were, showcasing Sandbox. As well as Axie Infinity. And that was actually only maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So it's amazing what has happened since.
Yeah. Well, you can bring your daughter as well. And,
yes, absolutely.
That'll be fun. All right, thank you so much for doing this,
Thank you.
And keep in touch, I guess.
Absolutely.